Chapter 12. First Diplomatic Mission to England. Pennsylvania, being a proprietary rather than a royal colony, was owned by the descendants of its founder, William Penn. Unlike the earlier Penn, however, the current proprietors were not Quakers and did not look on the province as a holy experiment. They were interested in the profits which came from leases, quit rents, and land sales. A recurring cause of friction between the Pennsylvania Assembly, elected by the people, and the governor appointed by the proprietors was the fact that the proprietors consistently instructed their governors to veto any appropriation bills which attempted to tax proprietary estates in the colony, as they felt their own landholdings should be exempt from taxation. The people, however, and the representatives in the Assembly considered this an unfair practice, especially during periods when all other lands were taxed heavily for defense spending, and as in recent years. Franklin, who was usually appointed to draft the Assembly's pointed responses to the governor's vetoes, became one of the principal figures in these dissensions. William Denny, who replaced Robert Morris as governor in 1756, sought out Franklin as soon as he arrived in Philadelphia. He took me aside and acquainted me that he had been advised by his friends in England to cultivate a friendship with me as one who was capable of giving him the best advice and of contributing most effectively to the making his administration easy, that he therefore desired of all things to have a good understanding with me, and he begged me to be assured of his readiness on all occasions to render me every service that might be in his power. He said much to me also of the proprietor's good dispositions towards the province, and of the advantage it might be to us all, and to me in particular, if the opposition that had been so long continued to his measures were dropped, and harmony restored between him and the people, in effecting which it was thought no one could be more serviceable than myself, and I might depend on adequate acknowledgments and recompenses, etc., etc. My answers were to this purpose that my circumstances, thanks to God, were such as to make proprietary favors unnecessary to me, and that being a member of the Assembly, I could not possibly accept any, that, however, I had no personal enmity to the proprietary, and that whenever the public measures he proposed should appear to be for the good of the people, no one should espouse and forward them more zealously than myself. Unfortunately, when Governor Denny came to do business with the Assembly, it was soon obvious that he was acting on the same unfortunate instructions which had been given to his predecessors, and Franklin was as active as ever in the opposition. Following several more months of wrangling between the governor and the Assembly over the raising of defense funds, and after a number of dangerous victories by the Indians and the French, the Assembly resolved in early 1757 to send Franklin to England as a commissioner to argue their cause. I am ordered home to England, he wrote. In those days he considered himself a thorough Briton, as did most of the colonists. He also sent a note to his friend William Strahan, a London printer, to announce his expected arrival a few months later. Our Assembly talk of sending me to England speedily, then look out sharp, as if a fat old fellow should come to your printing house and request a little smouting, or part-time work. Depend upon it, 'tis your affectionate friend and humble servant. On April 4th, 1757, Franklin left Philadelphia with his son William, who had resigned his clerkship in the Assembly. After several idle weeks in New York while they waited for their ship to sail, they finally weighed anchor in mid-June. During the voyage, Franklin composed the preface to Poor Richard for 1758, wherein he assembled many of the short maxims in calculating industry and frugality which had appeared in earlier issues, and formed them into a connected discourse, as the herring of a wise old man to the people attending an auction. Later published separately as The Way to Wealth, this brief essay was eventually reprinted over 1,000 times and translated into at least 15 languages. Ironically, it has branded Franklin with the reputation of a penny pincher in many circles today, where people are unaware of his lifelong generosity to public and charitable causes. After a near shipwreck as they approached the English coast, the Franklins arrived in London on July 27th. They spent the first night with Peter Collinson, the Quaker merchant and scientist with whom Franklin had corresponded for several years. William Strahan, another prominent correspondent who later became printer to the king, visited Collinson's home the next day to meet his distinguished guest. Both of the Englishmen were instantly captivated by Franklin. The pair from Pennsylvania soon found lodging in an apartment on Craven Street, close to Parliament and the ministerial offices. William seemed to enjoy his new surroundings, and he made arrangements to continue his study of law, which he had begun in Philadelphia under his father's friend, Joseph Galloway. The elder Franklin complained of the polluted air in London. The whole town is one great smoky house, and every street a chimney, the air full of floating coal soot, and you never get a sweet breath of what is pure without riding some miles for it into the country. Working through intermediaries, Franklin at length arranged a meeting with Thomas Penn, proprietor of Pennsylvania. When the two came face to face to discuss their differences, the uncomplimentary opinions they had formed of each other at a distance seemed only to be confirmed and strengthened. Part of their conversation, as preserved in the surviving portion of a letter Franklin wrote several months after the meeting, reveals the difficulty of his assignment in England. "But," says I, "your father's charter expressly says that the Assembly of Pennsylvania shall have all the powers and privileges of an assembly according to the rights of free-born subjects of England, and is usual in any of the British plantations in America." "Yes," says he, "but if my father, William Penn, granted privileges he was not by royal charter empowered to grant, nothing can be claimed by such a grant." I said, "Then if your father had no right to grant the privileges he pretended to grant, and published all over Europe as granted, those who came to settle in the province on the faith of that grant, and in expectation of enjoying the privileges contained in it, were cheated, deceived, and betrayed." He answered that they should have themselves looked to that the royal charter was no secret. They who came into the province on his father's offer of privileges, if they were deceived, it was their own fault. And that, he said, with a kind of triumphing, laughing insolence, such as a low jockey might do when a purchaser complained that he had cheated him on a horse. I was astonished to see him thus meanly give up his father's character, and conceived at that moment a more cordial and thorough contempt for him than I ever felt for any man living. Franklin first expected to complete his business in London within a single summer, then a year, then 2 years, but he was absent from his home and family over 5 years before he returned to Philadelphia in 1762. During this period, he wrote often to his wife, many times expressing how much he missed her. The salutation was always, "My dear child," or "My dear Debbie," and he usually closed with the words, "Your affectionate husband," or "Your ever-loving husband." In one of these letters he wrote, "You may think, perhaps, that I can find many amusements here to pass the time agreeably. 'Tis true, the regard and friendship I meet with from persons of worth, and the conversation of ingenious men, give me no small pleasure. But at this time of life, domestic comforts afford the most solid satisfaction, and my uneasiness at being absent from my family, and longing desire to be with them, make me often sigh in the midst of cheerful company." On another occasion, in keeping with his habit of sending gifts from England to family members, he shipped Deborah a large jug for beer because its shape reminded him happily of her. "I have 1,000 times wished you with me," he told her, and he even persuaded his friend Strahan to write Mrs. Franklin a letter urging her to come to London. But she was terrified of the water, and Franklin was sure she would never cross the ocean under any circumstances. In February 1759, the University of St. Andrews in Scotland awarded Franklin an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. Thereafter, his friends called him Dr. Franklin. In August of that year, he left with William for a tour of northern England and Scotland. Franklin thoroughly enjoyed himself there, meeting and dining with a number of Scottish intellectuals, including David Hume, Adam Smith, and Henry Home of Cambs. With Lord Combs in particular, he established a warm and endearing friendship. After returning to London in October, Franklin wrote to this renowned judge and author that he considered the time he had spent in Scotland 6 weeks of the densest happiness I have met with in any part of my life. In the same letter, he shared his views regarding the recent favorable turns in the ongoing war between French and English forces in North America. "No one can more sincerely rejoice than I do on the reduction of Canada, and this is not merely as I am a colonist, but as I am a Briton. I have long been of opinion that the foundations of the future grandeur and stability of the British Empire lie in America, and though, like other foundations, they are low and little seen, they are nevertheless broad and strong enough to support the greatest political structure human wisdom ever yet erected. I am therefore by no means for restoring Canada. If we keep it, all the country from the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi will in another century be filled with British people. Britain itself will become vastly more populous by the immense increase of its commerce. The Atlantic Sea will be covered with your trading ships, and your naval power, thence continually increasing, will extend your influence round the whole globe and awe the world. If the French remain in Canada, they will continually harass our colonies by the Indians and impede, if not prevent, their growth. Your progress to greatness will at best be slow and give room for many accidents that may forever prevent it." In much of his future correspondence, Franklin would repeat this call for private and public recognition of America's important place in the empire until the year 1775, when it finally became clear that Englishmen across the Atlantic would have to seek another solution to their ill treatment from the crown. Meanwhile, Franklin continued for his countrymen's right to tax the proprietary estates along with their own. It was not a simple task. You may conjecture, he wrote the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, what reception a petition concerning privileges from the colonies may meet with from those who think that even the people of England have too many. But he pushed ahead, often using the British press for the purpose of removing the prejudices that art and accident have spread among the people of this country against us, and obtaining for us the good opinion of the bulk of mankind. In 1759, he arranged and paid for the publication of a book entitled An Historical Review of the Constitution and Government of Pennsylvania. He wrote many letters for the British newspapers, almost always employing a fictitious name to hide his identity or arouse curiosity. Including his second mission to England from 1764 to 1775, he used at least 42 pseudonyms in 90 or more items placed in the English papers. Because of these and other activities, Thomas Penn developed a great animosity toward the Pennsylvania agent. When I meet him anywhere, wrote Franklin, there appears in his wretched countenance a strange mixture of hatred, anger, fear, and vexation. But Penn was not able to prevent the ultimate triumph of Franklin's cause. In August 1760, Franklin and his attorneys were summoned to a meeting of the Privy Council's Committee for Plantation Affairs. They were asked to defend a bill passed by the Pennsylvania Assembly the previous year, which levied taxes on the proprietors' lands. Many such bills had been passed before, but this was the first to escape Governor Denny's veto due to the pressing need for defense funds. All bills signed by the governor were forwarded to England for royal assent. Penn's attorneys were also called to the meeting to argue against the bill. Upon hearing both sides of the issue and after accepting a minor amendment offered by Franklin on behalf of the Assembly, the committee voted to recommend the bill to the king for passage. Final approval was granted 4 days later, and the principle had been won. Franklin remained in London for 2 more years at the request of the Pennsylvania Assembly. During these 2 years, he continued his political activities in matters which concerned the province, but he also found more time for travel and for scientific pursuits. Soon after the meeting with the Privy Council Committee, he and William visited Coventry, Cheshire, Wales, Bristol, and Bath. In 1761, they journeyed to Flanders and Holland and enjoyed the beautiful sights and meetings with several men of science. They returned to London in time to attend the coronation ceremonies for King George III on September 22nd. For several months, Franklin was able to renew some of the experiments he had begun in Philadelphia after his retirement from business. He furthered his investigations into electricity, evaporation, and other areas of interest, always comparing notes with his scientific correspondence. He developed ideas for another fireplace by experimenting in his London apartment. Sometime during this period, he also invented an unusual musical instrument which he called the harmonica. It was a long wooden case containing a series of glass hemispheres which were mounted on an axle that could be turned with a foot pedal. These glass bowls were blown and ground to produce 37 separate tones, which Franklin called incomparably sweet beyond those of any other instrument. A performer played the harmonica by sitting in front of the open case and pressing his moistened fingers against the revolving edges of the glasses. Copies of the harmonica were manufactured, sold, and later played at public recitals in Italy, Austria, Germany, and America. Both Mozart and Beethoven composed pieces for this novel instrument, which was quite popular throughout Europe for almost 40 years. Franklin himself brought one home to Philadelphia, where he played duets with his daughter Sally as she performed on the harpsichord he had sent her from England. In April 1762, Franklin was awarded another honorary degree by Oxford University. As his reputation increased, so did the admiration of other learned men of his time. Several weeks before he left England, the Scottish historian and philosopher David Hume wrote to him, "I am very sorry that you intend to soon leave our hemisphere. America has sent us many good things, gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, indigo, etc. But you are the first philosopher, and indeed the first great man of letters for whom we are beholden to her." By July of 1762, Franklin could no longer bear being away from his wife and his home. "I feel here like a thing out of its place," he told his friend William Stratham, "and useless because it is out of its place. How then can I any longer be happy in England? I must go home." Deborah was just as eager for his return. After learning that he was soon to be on his way, she recorded in her household account book a purchase of goodies for my pappy, 2 jars. But despite his longing for this joyous reunion, he still had mixed feelings about leaving England. The week before his departure, he confided to Lord Combs, I cannot leave this happy island and my friendship in it without extreme regret. Though I am going to a country and a people that I love, I am going from the old world to the new, and I fancy I feel like those who are leaving this world for the next. Grief at the parting, fear of the passage, hope of the future. Indeed, he secretly hoped he could eventually return to London with his wife and daughter. Let me find you well and happy, he wrote Strathern, when I come again to England. Happy England. In 2 years, at farthest, I hope to settle all my affairs in such a manner as that I may then conveniently remove to England, provided we can persuade the good woman to cross the seas. That will be the great difficulty. It proved to be an even greater difficulty than Franklin anticipated. He did return to England 2 years later, but not with Deborah or Sally. When Franklin sailed in late August, his son was not with him. Upon completing his legal studies and being admitted to the English bar in 1758, William had written to his father, I am extremely obliged to you for your care in supplying me with money, and shall ever have a grateful sense that with the other numberless indulgences I have received from your paternal affection, I shall be ready to return to America or to go to any other part of the world whenever you think it necessary. But when the time came, he was not ready. On September 4th, 1762, he married a young woman named Elizabeth Downs, and 5 days later he was commissioned Royal Governor of New Jersey. Friends of the elder Franklin had apparently helped secure this appointment. William and his bride would return to America early the next year so that he could assume his new post. And that is the end of chapter 12.